For decades, Russia's nuclear weapons have been a symbol of fear and power. But behind the threats and propaganda lies a reality filled with corruption, aging weapons, and logistical failures that have left much of its nuclear capability in doubt. Despite Putin's threats, using these weapons is more impossible than it seems. Novaya Zemlya, a remote and icy archipelago in the Arctic, became one of the most popular places on Earth during the Cold War. From 1955 to 1990, it was the Soviet Union's primary site for nuclear testing, hosting over 220 detonations. The combined energy released by these explosions was equivalent to 265 megatons of TNT, which is an unimaginable figure when you consider that all the explosives used during World War II, including the atomic bombs, amounted to only a fraction of that. At the center of this testing program was the Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated. On October 30th, 1961, this massive hydrogen bomb was dropped over Novaya Zemlya, unleashing a blast with a yield of 50 megatons. To put that in perspective, it was about 1,570 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. The effects of the Tsar Bomba were huge. Its mushroom cloud rose up roughly 40 miles into the atmosphere, 7 times the height of Mount Everest. And the shock waves circled the globe 3 times. The blast created seismic activity equivalent to a magnitude 5 earthquake, leaving a lasting scar on the region. Yet despite its terrifying power, the Tsar Bomba was not a practical weapon. Its sheer size made it nearly impossible to deliver in real combat. It required a massive aircraft to carry it, which could easily be shot down long before reaching any target. In reality, this weapon was more about sending a message to the world than any real tactical use. The Soviet Union used the Zar Bomba as a show of strength during a tense period of the Cold War. It was a way to intimidate adversaries and remind them of the USSR's technological prowess. But the practical flaws of the bomb showed the challenges of nuclear warfare, where bigger doesn't always mean better. The testing on Novaya Zemlya left behind a grim legacy. The indigenous Nenets people, who had lived there for generations, were forced to leave, losing their homes and way of life. The environment paid a heavy price as well. Radiation from the explosions contaminated the land, ice, and water, leaving a toxic footprint that still exists today. The Zar Bomba, while a symbol of power, also served as a turning point. Its destructiveness resulted in international debates about the dangers of nuclear weapons. Just 2 years after its detonation, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed, banning atmospheric testing. This marked the beginning of efforts to reduce nuclear fallout and control the arms race. For decades, Russia's nuclear capabilities have been seen as one of its greatest strengths. Much of this perception comes from the Soviet era, when propaganda and the Cold War portrayed the country as a nuclear superpower. Even today, this image persists, shaped by memories of the Soviet Union's vast stockpile and the fear it inspired. But the reality in 2024 is far more complicated and less certain. As of 2024, Russia is estimated to have approximately 4,380 nuclear weapons, with about 1,710 of these actively deployed, ready to be launched from missiles or stationed at bomber bases. These figures seem imposing, but they represent a major decline from the Soviet Union's peak in the 1980s, when it had more than 40,000 warheads. Arms control agreements like the New START Treaty have played a major role in these reductions, capping the number of deployed strategic nuclear weapons for both Russia and the United States at 1,550 each. For comparison, the United States maintains around 3,750 nuclear weapons, with 1,389 currently deployed. On paper, Russia's numbers are slightly higher, but numbers alone do not tell the full story. The real question lies in whether these weapons are reliable, modern, and usable in a crisis. And this is where doubts start to creep in. Maintaining and upgrading nuclear weapons is a complex and expensive process. Every warhead requires regular maintenance to keep it functional, and delivery systems, such as missiles, submarines, and bombers, need constant modernization to remain effective. This is a costly task, and Russia's financial situation places it at a major disadvantage. In 2022, Russia's entire military budget was around $81.7 billion, covering everything from ground forces to air defense to nuclear maintenance. The United States, by comparison, spent $801 billion on its military that year, which is nearly 10 times more. Of this, the U.S. allocated over $50 billion solely for the maintenance of its nuclear forces. Two-thirds of Russia's overall military budget is equal to this one expense. Russia's limited resources mean tough decisions have to be made. While the government has prioritized the development of new systems like the Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile and the hypersonic Avangard glide vehicle, much of its nuclear stockpile still consists of Soviet-era weapons. Many of these older systems are past their prime and require extensive refurbishment to remain operational. Reports suggest that a major portion of Russia's nuclear weapons may no longer be functional due to aging components and a lack of consistent maintenance. But it does not end there. Corruption adds another layer to the problem. Decades of mismanagement and embezzlement within the defense sector have diverted funds away from important projects. The issues exposed during Russia's conventional military operations in Ukraine, such as outdated equipment, logistical failures, and low-quality supplies, suggest similar problems could exist within its nuclear forces. If funding for basic military needs has been misappropriated, it's likely that nuclear maintenance budgets have also been affected. Another challenge lies in testing. Nuclear weapons require regular testing to ensure their reliability, but Russia has not conducted a nuclear test since 1990 due to international treaties banning such activities. While computer simulations can help, they are not a substitute for real-world testing. Without it, even newly developed weapons may face reliability issues. Consider the Sarmat ICBM, for example. Capable of carrying multiple warheads and bypassing missile defenses, it represents the future of Russia's strategic deterrence. But delays and technical challenges have delayed its development, with reports suggesting that production has been slower than expected. The same is true for the Avangard, which, despite its advanced technology, exists in very limited numbers. These high-profile projects demonstrate Russia's ambitions, but also indicate its struggles to modernize under financial and logistical constraints. On top of that, economic realities further complicate matters. Unlike the United States, which can sustain high defense spending without major strain, Russia's economy is heavily dependent on energy exports. International sanctions, declining oil and gas revenues, and the ongoing war in Ukraine have placed a huge pressure on the country's finances. With resources stretched thin, maintaining a credible nuclear force becomes increasingly difficult. Public perception of Russia's nuclear strength remains influenced by its Cold War legacy, but the reality today is more fragile. The combination of aging systems, insufficient funding, corruption, and lack of testing has eroded its ability to project nuclear power effectively. While Russia still possesses a large stock of nuclear weapons, the gap between perception and reality raises serious questions about their functionality and reliability. The world continues to view Russia as a strong nuclear power, but the cracks in this image are becoming harder to ignore. As economic challenges grow and weapons age further, Russia's ability to maintain its status as a top nuclear power may be more uncertain than it appears. During the Cold War, mutually assured destruction, MAD, became one of the most important doctrines in preventing a full-scale nuclear war. It was not born out of a moral stance, but rather cold logic, which is the certainty that any nuclear strike by one superpower would provoke an equally devastating retaliatory strike, leaving both nations obliterated. As a result, there was a paradoxical situation in which the very fact that nuclear weapons existed discouraged their use. In the 1950s and 1960s, both the United States and the Soviet Union raced to build massive nuclear stockpiles. Each side developed systems capable of launching nuclear strikes from land-based silos, submarines, and strategic bombers. These triads ensured a credible second strike capability. The principle was simple. Even if a nation absorbed a catastrophic first strike, enough of its nuclear forces would survive to launch a retaliatory attack, guaranteeing mutual destruction. The sheer scale of these arsenals showed the seriousness of MAD. At its peak, the US had over 31,000 warheads, and the Soviet Union claimed to have around 45,000. This level of overkill was excessive and strategic. Both superpowers believed that overwhelming force was necessary to eliminate any doubt in the other's mind about the consequences of a nuclear attack. This logic was reinforced during major crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. For 13 days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war as the United States and the Soviet Union confronted each other over the placement of Soviet missiles in Cuba. The prospect of annihilation forced both sides to step back from the edge. The crisis showed the stabilizing effect of MAD, as neither superpower could risk a direct confrontation when the outcome would mean their own destruction. MAD also shaped nuclear strategy in subtler ways. For instance, both sides developed launch-on-warning systems designed to ensure a retaliatory strike even if a first strike was imminent. This increased the risk of accidental launches, but it also reinforced the deterrent effect. The mere possibility of an immediate and unstoppable counterattack made the idea of a nuclear first strike nearly unthinkable. Fast forward to today, and the doctrine of MAD still looms large in global nuclear strategy, especially for nations like Russia and the United States. While the Cold War ended decades ago, the basic principles remain the same. A nuclear conflict between major powers would be catastrophic for all involved. For Russia, MAD represents a major constraint on its nuclear options. Even with its large stockpile of weapons, any use of these weapons would trigger a chain reaction that would devastate the country itself. NATO allies, led by the United States, maintain a strong nuclear deterrent, including thousands of warheads, advanced delivery systems, and sophisticated early warning networks. These systems ensure that even a massive first strike by Russia would not eliminate NATO's ability to retaliate. The consequences of such retaliation would be catastrophic for Russia. A coordinated nuclear response from NATO could obliterate key Russian cities, military bases, and infrastructure, leaving the nation in ruins. This harsh reality makes the actual use of nuclear weapons strategically unviable, no matter how desperate the situation. But MAD's implications go beyond simple deterrence. The concept inherently assumes rational actors, leaders who value the survival of their own nations above all else. This is where the uncertainty lies. In recent years, Vladimir Putin's increasingly erratic behavior and threat have raised concerns about the stability of MAD. Frequent nuclear threats, as seen during the Ukraine conflict, can lessen the credibility of deterrence if they are not followed by action. However, even in these moments, the logic of MAD prevails. Any nuclear escalation by Russia would invite total annihilation. Despite the challenges, MAD remains a powerful deterrent because it creates a no-win scenario for all involved. Modern nuclear weapons are vastly more destructive than those used during World War II. A single thermonuclear bomb could obliterate a city and its surrounding areas, killing millions in an instant and rendering the region uninhabitable for decades. Now imagine hundreds or thousands of such bombs detonating in a matter of hours. This is the scale of destruction that MAD promises, and it is why even the most aggressive nations tread carefully when dealing with nuclear powers. Advancements in missile defense systems and early warning technologies have also reinforced the credibility of MAD. While no system can completely neutralize a large-scale nuclear attack, these defenses make it even more difficult for a first strike to succeed without provoking retaliation. For example, the United States Ground-Based Mid-Course Defense, GMD, and NATO's layered missile defense systems provide additional layers of security, ensuring that no nuclear attack could occur without severe consequences for the attacker. Russia, too, understands this logic. While it frequently engages in nuclear saber-rattling, issuing threats and showcasing new weapons, its actions remain limited by the reality of MAD. The doctrine deters nuclear use while also shaping military strategies, geopolitical posturing, and even arms control agreements. For example, treaties like New START have capped the number of deployed strategic weapons, ensuring that the balance of power remains stable. While MAD has successfully prevented nuclear war, it is not without its flaws. The system relies heavily on the assumption of rationality. If a nation miscalculates, or if a leader acts irrationally, the entire framework could collapse. Similarly, technological failures, such as false alarms and early warning systems, pose a constant risk. During the Cold War, there were multiple instances where human judgment narrowly averted accidental nuclear launches. MAD also becomes less effective in conflicts involving non-state actors or rogue states. Groups or nations without a clear return address, those not easily targeted by a retaliatory strike, challenge the traditional logic of MAD. While this does not directly apply to Russia, it shows the evolving nature of nuclear threats in the modern world. For Russia, this doctrine is both a safeguard and a constraint. Even with thousands of nuclear weapons, the risks of using them far outweigh any potential benefits. In a world shaped by the logic of MAD, the best strategy for survival is not to press the button. But what would happen if Russia decided to ever use nuclear weapons? Beyond the catastrophic physical consequences, the political fallout would be equally devastating. In the current geopolitical climate, the use of nuclear weapons by any nation, especially Russia, would lead to major international isolation and challenge the global system of alliances and deterrence. Russia already faces major sanctions and diplomatic condemnation due to its actions in Ukraine. But a nuclear strike would take this to an entirely new level, crossing a line that no major power has dared to breach since World War II. Such an act would instantly transform Russia into a global pariah, triggering near-universal condemnation, even from nations that have traditionally maintained neutral or friendly relations with Moscow, such as China and India. Using nuclear weapons would violate fundamental principles of international law, including the Charter of the United Nations, which prohibits acts of aggression that threaten global peace. It would also undermine decades of nuclear non-proliferation efforts backed by treaties like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. As a signatory to the NPT, Russia is bound by its commitments to limit the use of nuclear weapons and to aim for disarmament. Violating these agreements would affect Russia's credibility and also encourage other nations to pursue their nuclear ambitions, leading to an even more volatile global situation. The economic fallout would be swift and severe. Current sanctions on Russia target specific sectors, such as energy and finance. But a nuclear strike would invite far harsher measures. Western nations, led by the United States and the European Union, would likely implement secondary sanctions to cut Russia off entirely from global trade. Key sectors of Russia's economy, particularly oil and gas exports, which account for a major portion of government revenue, would face embargoes, worsening the economic crisis the country is already struggling with. But that is just the start. Diplomatic isolation would further add to these economic challenges. Russia would find itself excluded from major international forums, such as the United Nations Security Council, where it currently owns veto power. Even countries like Turkey and Brazil, which have tried to balance relations between Russia and the West, would likely distance themselves, unwilling to align with a nation that has broken one of the ultimate taboos in modern warfare. Furthermore, Russia's nuclear use would likely shatter its relationships with China and India, two nations that have remained cautious allies. Both have emphasized the importance of sovereignty and stability on the global stage, and neither would carry out actions that threaten their economic and geopolitical interests. Losing these partnerships would leave Russia completely isolated. While Russia might consider using nuclear threats to intimidate or divide Western alliances, the reality is that such actions would only strengthen them. NATO's strength lies in its principle of collective defense, articulated in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. This principle ensures that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all, guaranteeing a unified response. The existence of NATO's nuclear sharing agreements further reinforces this deterrence. Member states like Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands host U.S. nuclear weapons under these agreements, ensuring that NATO can respond quickly to any nuclear aggression. This collective deterrence is supported by NATO's Nuclear Planning Group, NPG, which coordinates strategy and ensures cohesion among member states in the event of a nuclear crisis. For Russia, this collective defense mechanism presents a major challenge. A nuclear strike on any NATO member would trigger immediate retaliation from the entire alliance, including its three nuclear-armed members, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. The resulting conflict would be catastrophic for Russia, as the alliance's combined nuclear and conventional military capabilities far outweigh its own. Even beyond NATO, alliances in the Asia-Pacific region, such as those between the United States, Japan, South Korea, and Australia would play a role in isolating Russia further. While these nations are geographically distant from Europe, their economic and military influence would contribute to a broader effort to contain Russian aggression. Their advanced missile defense systems and strategic alliances ensure that any spillover from a nuclear conflict could be contained, reducing Russia's ability to exploit global divisions. Apart from the military alliances, global institutions like the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, would rally to condemn Russia's actions. Such a move would likely trigger a renewed focus on non-proliferation, with countries pushing for stricter controls on nuclear technology and weaponry. This would make it nearly impossible for Russia to rebuild its reputation or regain trust in the global community. Ultimately, using nuclear weapons would undermine Russia's own strategic goals. While such an action might achieve short-term military gains or force an adversary to capitulate, the long-term costs far outweigh any potential benefits. The resulting isolation, combined with heavy economic sanctions, would leave Russia in a weaker position than ever before. Nuclear use would also fundamentally alter global alliances in ways unfavorable to Russia. Neutral states would be driven to strengthen their ties with NATO and other Western powers, further marginalizing Moscow. Countries in regions like Eastern Europe and Central Asia, which Russia has historically sought to influence, would likely accelerate their shift away from Moscow's orbit, seeking protection under Western-backed security frameworks. Even within Russia, the political fallout could be severe. An act of nuclear aggression would likely deepen existing divisions within the government and military as leaders struggle with the consequences of international isolation and economic collapse. The Russian populace, already facing hardships due to sanctions and war, would bear the burden of these consequences, potentially leading to widespread unrest. And so for Russia, as for any nuclear power, the doctrine of deterrence remains the only possible path forward. Any deviation from this logic would result in disaster, not just for the world, but for Russia itself. Russia's nuclear weapons have long been symbols of power and intimidation, but the realities of their use paint a much different picture. From technical limitations and economic constraints to the logic of deterrence and the threat of catastrophic retaliation, the barriers to pressing the button are higher than ever. The global consequences of such an act make the idea strategically unthinkable. Russia's future, like the rest of the world's, depends on restraint and the continued avoidance of nuclear conflict. But this leaves us with a pressing question. As global tensions rise and new powers emerge, what will the next chapter of nuclear strategy look like? Stay tuned as we explore how the world's shifting dynamics are shaping the future of deterrence, diplomacy, and the balance of power.